So everyone talks about Walter White like he was some criminal mastermind, a meticulous genius who only fell because the DEA finally closed in. But here's the part nobody seems to admit. Walter White wasn't taken down by law enforcement, the cartel, or some grand master plan. He was taken down by himself, by the one thing he always believed made him untouchable. Because when Hank finally discovers the truth, it isn't through surveillance, wiretaps, or detective brilliance. It happens because Walt leaves a book. Yes, a book, sitting in his own bathroom with an inscription so painfully arrogant, it might as well have been signed, "Yours truly, Heisenberg." And that's the real secret behind Walter White's downfall. Not genius, not strategy, not even bad luck. Vanity. A man so obsessed with being recognized, so hungry to be seen as brilliant, that he literally preserved the evidence of his own crimes like a trophy. The ultimate self-inflicted wound. Today, we're breaking down how a single moment of pride unraveled everything, and why Walter's biggest enemy was never the DEA, the cartel, or even cancer. It was Walter White. The great irony of Walter White's downfall is that it arrives not through a grand shootout, an elaborate DEA operation, or even the machinations of one of the many adversaries he taunts into existence, but through a bathroom break. A single poetry book, thoughtlessly left within reach of the one man whose suspicions had been conveniently lulled for far too long, becomes the catalyst that crumbles the myth of Heisenberg. And yes, the fatal clue is delivered with all the elegance of a parody sketch. To my other favorite, WW. It is a revelation so structurally absurd that it borders on self-satire. The joke practically writes itself, like a scene smuggled in from a cartoon, where a villain signs his crimes, Bad Guy Inc., and then acts surprised when someone connects the dots. Yet this absurdity is precisely what makes the moment so devastatingly believable. The show's most meticulous chemist, self-styled mastermind of crystalline empire building, lets his empire collapse not through malice or plot armor, but through the mundane convergence of arrogance, forgetfulness, and the randomness of domestic life. In a sense, the entire story has been preparing viewers for this punchline. That fateful inscription first appears in Gale's lab notes, where Hank jokingly teases that the mysterious WW might be none other than the mild-mannered chemistry teacher across the table. Walt, nerves flaring and ego twitching, scrambles to redirect the interpretation toward Whitman. It's a flimsy dodge that works only because no one, especially Hank, is prepared to imagine this socially awkward family man as a drug kingpin. Later, when the other WW inscription appears in Leaves of Grass, written in Gale's handwriting and addressed with the affectionate reverence of a disciple, the coincidence becomes impossible to dismiss. The repetition is so on the nose, it could earn a guest spot on a sitcom. The structure mirrors the famous joke of the character who uses an alias so obvious that the reveal becomes a self-parody. Walt's elaborately crafted double life, his carefully maintained facade of suburban normalcy, collapses under the weight of a dedication page. Critics love to imagine an alternate universe in which Walt, ever cautious and impossibly thorough, would have burned every incriminating scrap the moment Gale died. This fantasy version of Walter White exists solely in revisionist hindsight. The real Walter White, the character who actually inhabits the story, is far too enthralled by his own myth to be so prudent. The man keeps trophies. He savors reminders of his own genius. Gale's admiration was a balm he could not resist. Leaves of Grass becomes his private Nobel Prize, an affirmation of the greatness the world denied him. The fact that it comes from someone he both exploited and orchestrated the death of only adds to its dark allure. For a man who rarely received praise, the book becomes a monument to his talent, an indulgent relic of self-worship. It was destined to remain on the shelf, in the reading pile, or, disastrously, on the bathroom tank. The issue is not that Walt forgot to hide the book. The issue is that Walt never intended to hide the book. He assumed it was safe because he assumed he was untouchable. One popular defense insists that Walt simply forgot the inscription existed. His life, after all, was an ever-tightening vice of stressors: cartel threats, Gus's manipulation, domestic deception, the fragile psyche of Jesse, the car wash laundering operation, his own deteriorating health, and a growing web of lies. The book becomes just one object among hundreds in an avalanche of obligations, each more immediate and terrifying than a possible coincidence of initials. And indeed, the bathroom where the book sits is used almost exclusively by his own family, making Hank's discovery feel like a one-in-a-million misfortune, a cosmic joke with impeccable comedic timing. Still, it would be naive to attribute the oversight purely to stress. The more accurate explanation lies in Walt's defining flaw: arrogance so profound it borders on metaphysical. Walt repeatedly demonstrates an unwavering belief in his ability to manage every variable in existence. He outwits cartel bosses, manipulates Jesse, maneuvers around DEA surveillance, and kills Gus Fring, a feat that earns him an intoxicating sense of invincibility. Having survived every conceivable threat, he begins to trust his own myth. He forgets that the smallest, stupidest mistake can topple an empire precisely because he no longer believes he is capable of making stupid mistakes. The scene in which Hank makes his discovery is brutal not because Walt slips, but because he never believed he could. The irony is that Walt's carelessness is not an aberration. It is a long-standing pattern. Despite the reputation fans occasionally project onto him as a meticulous mastermind, Walt's career as a criminal begins with a trail of blunders bright enough to be seen from space. He steals lab equipment from his school, leaves incriminating materials at crime scenes, improvises alibis with the desperation of a child caught lying about homework, entrusts critical responsibilities to a former student with a penchant for self-destruction, and stores life-altering sums of money in the kinds of hiding places that would embarrass an amateur burglar. His infamous fugue state is a transparent farce that nearly collapses under the weight of its own implausibility. His money laundering is an afterthought, and his attempts to keep secrets from his family oscillate between laughable and tragic. He is quick-thinking, lucky, and bold, qualities that masquerade as competence, but he never approaches the disciplined caution of Gus or the methodical professionalism of Mike. The myth of Walt's perfection persists largely because he survives despite himself. By sheer force of intelligence, intuition, and dumb fortune, he defeats adversaries who should have crushed him. He takes down men far more powerful, aggressive, and connected. He earns victories that defy probability, and each one inflates his ego until it becomes a helium balloon floating at the ceiling of the universe. It is no wonder, then, that he goads Hank into continuing the Heisenberg investigation after Gus's death. Drunk on triumph, he cannot resist the urge to show off, to hint that the DEA's prized case remains unsolved because its subject is far more brilliant than they realize. In that moment, his pride eclipses any instinct for self-preservation. The Leaves of Grass fiasco, therefore, is not a lapse in character. It is the culmination of his character. It crystallizes his contradictions. A man smart enough to build an empire, yet foolish enough to leave its Achilles heel next to the toilet. A man obsessed with control, yet blind to the randomness that undermines it. A man who abandons caution for glory, prudence for pride. The very trait that made him formidable, his unwavering belief in his own superiority, renders him fatally vulnerable. What follows Hank's discovery is not a clean prosecution, but the slow, torturous assembly of suspicion. Legally speaking, Hank possesses nothing more than a coincidence of initials and a dead man's handwriting. Handwriting analysis is flimsy even under ideal conditions, and the inscription proves nothing more damning than a prior acquaintance between two chemists. From a courtroom standpoint, it is the weakest of threads. Hank cannot walk into the DEA and proclaim that his brother-in-law is the drug kingpin. Professional pride alone forbids such recklessness. More importantly, the evidence is insufficient. Suspicion is not prosecution. Knowledge is not proof. Yet the real power of Hank's discovery lies in what it unlocks in his own mind. Once Hank recognizes Gale's handwriting in a book sitting proudly in Walt's home, every previously dismissed oddity reasserts itself with brutal clarity. The missing equipment from Walt's lab, the chemistry expertise that perfectly matches Heisenberg's product, the strange behaviors at work, the coincidences during tailing Fring, the ludicrous gambling addiction storyline, the expensive purchases, the new cars, Skylar's sudden fear, the car wash, the cash-filled sports bag Walt once blurted about. Every piece reorders itself into an unavoidable truth. The bathroom reveal is not the evidence. It is the key that unlocks the pattern. Walt's defenders frequently argue that the show undermines its own credibility by suggesting he could be so careless. Yet this argument conveniently forgets that Walt's entire trajectory is one long string of impulsive choices made by a man convinced his intellect exempts him from consequences. He gives his life savings to a small-time criminal to buy an RV. He allows his mask to slip in front of family. He wades into cartel dealings with the naivete of a man who believes chemistry equips him to survive gunmen. His intelligence is undeniable, but his judgment is catastrophically myopic. Even Walt's most ardent critics occasionally hesitate to acknowledge the full extent of his arrogance, preferring to cling to the narrative that the book's placement constitutes weak writing or out-of-character behavior. But the reality is this: the book only exists in his home at all because he enjoyed owning it. Gale's inscription worships him as a genius, a muse, a scientific luminary. For a man who spent decades feeling invisible, overlooked, and cheated of recognition, the book is validation in hardcover form. To discard it would require a humility he has never possessed and a conscience he refuses to acknowledge. Walt's pride outweighs his paranoia. It always has. The moral symmetry is almost too poetic. Gale, the gentle, earnest man who admired Walt more than anyone else, ultimately becomes the unwitting instrument of Walt's exposure. It is, in a sense, Gale's revenge from beyond the grave. The book's inscription, written with sincerity and affection, becomes a silent accusation. Walt's refusal to discard it reflects not only his vanity, but his inability to feel remorse. It is one of the few trophies he keeps from a man whose death he orchestrated, a macabre souvenir that mirrors how serial offenders sometimes cling to tokens of their victims. Unlike Hank with Tuco's grill, an object he ultimately rejects by throwing it into the river, Walt embraces his memento. He cherishes it, and for that, he pays the ultimate price. Of course, if one insists on fantasy, one might imagine Walt inventing a spontaneous story to explain the inscription. Perhaps a fabricated conference, an invented connection, a conveniently forgotten anecdote. But Hank is not stupid enough to accept such improvisation, and the sudden invention of a Gale-Walt friendship would only deepen his suspicion. The time for excuses expired the moment Hank held the book in his hands. Could Walt have played dumb in the garage and stonewalled Hank's confrontation? Possibly. But by then, the psychological landscape had already shifted. Hank has decades of familiarity with Walt as a harmless, unambitious family man, a stereotype that blinded him for years. Once that illusion shatters, the man before him is no longer a brother-in-law, but a suspect whose intelligence and capacity for deception have been catastrophically underestimated. The garage confrontation is therefore not an interrogation, but an emotional reckoning. Hank's case may be legally weak, but morally, the truth is complete. The hypothetical question of whether the show would make Walt's guilt obvious if told from Hank's point of view misses the more complex truth. Hank's blind spot is the narrative engine. The audience sees Walt in his full duplicity, unencumbered by familial bias or emotional investment. Hank sees a quiet, awkward man with terminal cancer and a new baby, a man who seems allergic to risk and indifferent to masculine posturing. Walt appears incapable of criminality because Hank cannot imagine him capable of aggression, let alone empire building. Even Walt's interest in DEA operations appears to Hank as mere nerdy fascination, not reconnaissance. The show does not hide Walt's crimes from Hank. Hank hides the possibility from himself. If the story were reframed entirely from Hank's perspective, it would require an expanded cast, subplots, and deeper exploration of Hank's world, not unlike how a certain Lawyers prequel revealed the rich interiority of a character once treated as comic relief. Hank's life does not begin or end with Heisenberg. To him, Heisenberg is a case, albeit an intriguing one overshadowed by encounters with the Salamancas and the trauma they inflict. The revelation that the mild, anxious brother-in-law is the mastermind behind his most elusive quarry would be a late series twist, a shocking but narratively coherent reconfiguration of everything he believed. Ultimately, the collapse of Walter White's empire is not caused by a bathroom book. The book is merely the trigger. The true architect of his downfall is the same force that propelled him into criminality. An ego desperate for validation, a man so intoxicated by his own brilliance that he discards humility like an inconvenient receipt. He wins battles that should have killed him, manipulates allies who should have abandoned him, and survives dangers he never fully comprehends. But he cannot outwit his own pride. The tragedy of Walter White is not that he makes one fatal mistake. It is that he makes the same mistake endlessly, dressed in different costumes. He believes he is always the smartest man in the room. He believes he can calculate every risk. He believes he can anticipate every threat. He believes loose ends stay tied because he tied them. In the end, he is undone by a reminder of his own greatness, an inscription that flatters him so perfectly he cannot bear to let it go. For a man who built an empire brick by brick, molecule by molecule, the fatal miscalculation is simple. He never understood that human error, not genius, rules the world. A single inscription, resting beside a toilet tank, becomes the instrument of poetic justice. Gale's soft-spoken admiration becomes Walt's undoing. The mighty Heisenberg is not defeated by rivals or federal agents, but by the vanity he carried home in a paperback. In the end, it is not a plot hole. It is not a contrivance. It is the only fitting consequence for a man who believed he was immune to consequence. Walter White does not fall because he forgets a book. He falls because he believes he cannot fall. Subscribe.